all this mental health speak. Another really good example of this is, so I remember I was seeing an assault victim in the emergency room at Mass General Hospital many years ago. And so the MIT chief of security campus security was there. And so I was talking to them a little bit about, because there were other students with the student who had been assaulted, and they were kind of talking to me about safety. And I remember something that the MIT chief told me that I've never forgotten. We were talking about safety, and he's like, my job is not to make people feel safe. My job is to make people safe. And there's actually a big difference. And so something interesting has happened. We have all become more narcissistic because that's what the internet does to us. And so now if I am hurt, that is no longer my responsibility. That is because you did something wrong. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like fundamentally, if I feel hurt, that is oftentimes tied to you doing something wrong. So there's this tendency towards victimization where you'll see even people who are like playing the victim card, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be believing victims. I think that's exactly what happens is we started to realize that we're not taking victims seriously, but then all the chameleons in our society were looking at this pattern and they were realizing, okay, the fastest way for me to get ahead is to claim to be a victim. So there are all kinds of weird permutations that are happening right now with this sort of emphasis on feeling. One more evidence-based example of this is, we're seeing the prevalence of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, addictions, body dysmorphia. Basically, everything is getting worse. And so one weird thing that started to happen is as we've talked more about feelings, there's something called a transdiagnostic factor, which we can get into. I don't know if you're familiar with these or not. But so if you look at like all of the mental illnesses, there are certain attributes that are a risk factor for multiple mental illnesses. So a good example of transdiagnostic factors are perfectionism and rumination. So rumination doesn't make you depressed, doesn't necessarily make you anxious. But if you have a high index of rumination, you are more likely to have a major depressive disorder. You're more likely to have an anxiety disorder. Does that kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. If you are perfectionistic, you are more likely to be depressed. You are more likely to be anxious. So there's one interesting transdiagnostic factor which has gotten way worse, which is something called distress tolerance. So human beings' capacity to sit with things and tolerate things that they do not find comfortable is starting to tank. And as that starts to tank, we're seeing just an explosion of mental illness.
Glucose is a key player in how our body functions.